The test that you've devised for athletes to do if they're away from you, what is that kind of? Is that pretty much the same, but you're only really utilizing RPE and heart rate? Because I guess that's really quite an important test for many people because they don't have access to VO2 Master or the Moxie. So I can imagine people listening to this podcast thinking, "Oh, I might give that a go." Yeah, sure, I don't have the equipment, but I can still do something that will allow me to estimate these training intensity domains, and I'll progress my training from there.
Yeah, 100%. And that's actually what I'm starting to move towards, looking at the not so distant future. I want to start writing some semi-individualized training programs for mainly for CrossFitters around these ergs, around the bike erg, the rower, and the ski erg as well. And so trying to devise a way that I could, again, individualize the intensities as best as possible and have something for them to track progress. So it's exactly what you said. Essentially, it's the exact same setup in terms of the test. So let's say somebody did their initial test on a bike erg and they started at an intensity of 100 watts and they were going up in 25-watt increments. So they do four minutes at 100 watts, 1 minute full rest, 4 minutes at 125 watts, 1 minute full rest, all the way to until they can't hold the pace anymore. For me, that would be at the 325 watt mark. And so if I do it with all the gear, then once I do it by myself, I could do it simply with, like you said, a heart rate monitor and with the RPE scale that I provide, which is the same as the one during the test, which has a bit of descriptive notions within each brackets, simply so people can have a reference point. Because for some people, it's really hard to listen to themselves, and you'll see a full step test, and they'll do 1, 1, 1, 2, 2, 3, 7, 10 on the RPE of each step, which usually means that they don't know how to listen to themselves very well. So I give that. And yeah, if they're able to replicate the exact same test, and that's what I love about the Concept 2 machines. It's super easy to plan intervals into the PM5, super simple to replicate the exact same setting that you did in your initial test. And then I just get people to record their heart rate data via, multiple apps can do it, but I use the VO2 Master app simply because that's the one I'm comfortable with. You're able to extract a nice clean CSV with the raw data, and I'm able to overlay the heart rate data from test one and from that intermediary test that they might do by themselves, and we can compare. Again, I look at usually the last minute of each 4-minute step, and I'll take the average of this for the heart rate reference at each power output. And so I'm able to compare that really easily from one test to the next, able to compare heart rate recovery in those 1 minute of rest between the steps. Like you said, compare the RPE as well, see how far they went on the whole test. And like you said, I think it's something that's quite accessible for anybody to do at home, in the sense of doing your 3 and 12-minute efforts to calculate your critical power. Use that as the 8th step on this 10-step step test. Start around, it's usually between 30 and 35% of the critical power that was found, and just kind of break it down into the appropriate steps. For some people, it's going to be 10-watt increments. For some of the stronger guys, the best guys that have tested, it's 30 watts from one step to the next. So there's a huge variation from one person to the other here. And the goal is to pick the interval or the increment in watts that's going to allow you to end on that 10-ish steps. Because in my estimation, if you do many less steps than 10, you don't have a lot of data to look at, and it's hard to then kind of pinpoint those inflection points that we're looking for, threshold 1, threshold 2. But then if you go beyond 12, now you're on the bike for more than an hour. It's very long. Some people might, get simply fatigued by the duration of the effort, regardless of the intensity of the test. So that's why I try to stay within those 10 steps. And again, you get a pretty good idea of that intensity distribution for yourself on the given modality that you're testing. I think it's important to point out that you cannot just transfer your zones or your values from a bike test to a run, for example, or vice versa. I've seen some fairly close values in CrossFitters between the bike and the rower in heart rates, and then with the equivalent wattage. But it's still not always the same. But again, 3 and 12-minute test, do that step test, 4 minutes on, 1 minute off with the parameters that I mentioned, and then do your training, and then do the exact same test again 3 to 4 months down the line. Compare the heart rate data, compare your RPE, compare your last step value in watts. I guess the only difficult part with this, if you don't have any measurement tools, is finding threshold one. So what I'll usually do is I'll use a 3-tiered system where for people that have done no low intensity training in the last 3 months or 1 hour or less per week, I'll usually put their first threshold at, I think it was 57% of their critical power, which is a fairly low value. For people who've done 2 to 3 hours per week of low intensity training in the last 3 months, I'll put their threshold one at 65%, I believe. And then for highly trained endurance athletes who are doing 4 hours or more per week for multiple weeks of properly calibrated zone 2 work, I'll plot it at 70 or 72% of critical power. So that's kind of my best way of guesstimating where that first threshold might be, based on how much low intensity work the different athletes have been doing. And yeah, from there you get your intensity domains, or at least a rough estimation of them. From what I've seen and from everything I've been able to collect, I'd say that's probably the most accurate way of determining your training zones, without any measurement tools beside a heart rate monitor. That might evolve down the line. I might find other ways to approach it that make more sense. But for now, that's 3 efforts, and that gives you a wide range of information on yourself. And I think it's a great starting point for people who want to dig into it, or like I said, kind of that in between step for people that have done the testing and want to see where they're at now.